Hey, how's it going, folks? This is Hellbent, and welcome to AutoHotkey Game Maker tutorial number 5. In this one, we're going to be looking at how to create a simple NPC that just walks around our screen, kind of like you might see in an RPG game, where you go into a town and you have a bunch of NPCs that are just walking around the town, doing their thing, blah blah blah, right? And in a future tutorial, perhaps the next one, we'll look at adding some other things to it. So, for example, this one, in this one we're just going to worry about the actual movement of the NPC and getting it to look like it's, an actual player that's walking around, it's doing its thing, right? And then later on, perhaps we'll work on things like having it shoot at other NPCs or having it shoot at players and having health and lives and everything like that. But for now, we're just going to worry about the movement of that object, of a non-player controlled object. So I hope that you've followed at least a little bit of the previous tutorials where we covered the introduction to the objects and building out the GUI and the things you need to make sure you know about the spacing of when you're putting the expression inside of the thing and everything like that. Because I'm not going to spend a lot of time covering all that in this tutorial. I'll talk about it a little bit as I'm typing it out, but I'm not going to really dive into stuff that I've covered before. Also, we're not going to be worrying about pretty images yet. We will start going into animation and adding images and things like that in future tutorials, but for now it's more about getting the logic programmed out and everything like that. I mean, if you'd like, I can open up my paint program, and I can put an image on the screen and we can stare at it for 20 minutes. It's not going to move around or do anything interesting, but I mean, we can stare at a pretty image if you'd like. I mean, I'd rather just have something that moves around and then afterwards maybe I can put some pretty images on it. But, I mean, that's me. Okay, so what we're going to need is we are going to need a object that's going to hold all the information for our NPC. And what we'll do in this tutorial is we'll set it up so that way we can add as many NPCs as we want. We're not going to worry about, in this tutorial, about their individual collisions with each other. We'll deal with that in a future tutorial. We're just going to concern ourselves with the movement of them. And then once we have the movement of them done, then we can go to another tutorial where we're looking at how they collide with each other, what happens if they collide with each other, etc., etc. But we're just going to get their basic motion, their movement settled out in this tutorial. So, like I said, we're going to create an object that we're going to be able to create multiples of them. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create initialize a object NPC. I'm going to call it the object NPC, and I'm just going to do this. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a loop. And to begin with, we're just going to deal with one NPC, and then later on we're going to change it so that way we can add as many as we want. So I'm going to set this to loop once, and then inside of the loop we're actually going to build our NPC, and our NPC is going to be an array of objects. So we're going to have, if we want to have 10 NPCs, they're all going to use the same framework, but it's going to be an array of them. So we're just going to do NPC and then open and close brace or brackets, and then because I have it inside of a loop, I'm going to use the built-in variable aIndex, which just keeps track of how many times my loop has gone through. So this variable here, every time our code encounters a loop, it sets this variable, it sets a copy of this variable to 1. And then each time we run through our loop, it takes that variable and it adds 1 to it. So the first time it runs through the loop, aIndex equals 1. So I'm saying, so this right here is the exact same at the moment as me typing out that. So NPC 1 equals an x, a y, a width, and a height. So I'm going to use aIndex. And then what does our NPC object need? Well, it needs a position on the screen, it needs a width, a height, it needs a direction that it's going to be moving in, it needs to know how fast it's going to be moving, it needs to know what direction it was moving in the previous instance that it moved. It's going to need a name, so that way we can add a image of it to represent it, which is just going to be a progress bar for this tutorial. and maybe a few other things, but we'll work that out as we go through it. So let's go ahead and create our object in here, our key value pair. So we're going to need an X position, we're going to need a Y position, we're going to need a width, a height, a direction. Now these vary. I've said it before, but I'll quickly touch on this again. These variables, these keys, they don't mean anything. I can call them whatever I want. I'm calling them this because these are ways for me to look at this and understand what that means. This X means that the thing that's stored in that is the X position. So whenever I'm using the X position, I know that I can use the NPC's X key to hold that value. Same with its Y, its width, and its height. I can call all of these Bob, Bob 1, Bob 2, Bob 3, Bob 4 if I want it to. These are not things that are in AutoHotkey. These are things that I'm inventing just to hold values. If you're not clear on that. These aren't actual things. Okay, so we need a direction, a last direction. We need a name. And we need, I don't know what else I need at the moment because I'm doing this off the top of my head. Okay, so let's go ahead. Now that I have this all ready, oh yeah, I do know what I need. I need a speed. So we need to know how many pixels it moves per frame. Okay, so we have the object set up. I haven't put any values into it yet, but we'll get to that once I build up the GUI. So I'm going to build out my GUI, GUI1. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set it to always on top. And if this tutorial doesn't take too long, what I'll do is I'll add the ability to resize in here. And if this tutorial isn't too long, we'll look at how to resize the screen and make it adjust our game dimensions. So actually, before we do that, I'm going to create another object, and I'm going to set this one to global so that way I don't have to pass it around later. Global, I'm going to call it game, and this is just going to have the width and height of our game board. So width, let's start with 500 pixels by 500 pixels. So this way later on, if we want to, we can adjust this and have it adjust all of our calculations that we're going to be doing later on with our X, Y, width, height, checking if we're in the game board, etc., etc. Okay, so we have, I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna set it up so that way we can resize the game, but I'm not sure if we'll have enough time in this tutorial to actually cover this. But I'll set it up anyways. Next thing I'll do is I'll set the GUI's background color. And I'll set it to black. And then I'm going to just show the GUI. And I'm going to show it at the width. The width is going to be game.width. Where did my cursor go? And the height is going to be game.height. And then we'll give this a name. We'll call it game1. I've already set up a timer for our game loop, and I've set up GUI close, GUI escape, and my exit out of the script, and our game loop subroutine. So it's already set. Set timer game loop 10 milliseconds. Now what we'll do is we're going to put this next part into a loop so that way later on if we add multiple NPCs it'll automatically build them in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set loop, and rather than hard coding the same value that I have up here where I'm saying loop once or loop 100 times or loop 10 times, in here instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to check how many NPCs were created up here. So however many were created up here, that's how many times we're going to loop this. So I'm going to put this as an expression with a %, and then beside that I'm going to say NPC dot length. So it's going to look the length of our array here, and that's how many times it's going to loop over this and build our object, or add our NPC. Our NPC, like I said, is just going to be a simple progress bar, just a little colorful square that we can move around and everything. So GUI 1 add progress, and we're going to put this as an expression. Its X position is going to be the NPC a index. So the first time it loops through, a index will equal 1. So NPC1 dot X. The Y position, NPC a index dot Y. We need a width. To hell with that. I hate typing. So I'm just going to cheat a little bit. Copy that and paste that. NPC width. This is going to be height, which is going to be NPC height. This is going to be the name variable, which is NPC dot name. And the last thing we'll add is, maybe later on we'll make it so that way we can change the color up in here, but for now we'll just hard code it. So I'm going to just do, and I'm not going to worry about a background around it or a border around it. So I'm just going to say background, and I'll make it red. Background red. Okay, so there's our NPC. Now that I've added this in here, we actually need to go into our object and actually specify some values. So it doesn't really matter what most of these things I give them. So I'm just going to say 200 for its X, 200 for its Y. I'll make it fairly large so you can see it easy. So 50 pixels tall by 50 pixels wide. I don't know if I said this before, but we're going to use something. We're going to use 4 directions. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if the direction is 1, it means that we're moving up. If the direction is 2, we're moving to the right. If the direction is 3, we're moving down. And if it's 4, we're moving to the left. So we're going to set it with a starting value of 1, which means it starts moving up. And what I'll actually do is so that way when we get into our code, we can do an early test before we get too much written out. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take its Y position and position it at the bottom, near the bottom of the screen. So we have a height of 500, so I'm going to position this at 450. So it's right at the bottom. So when we start the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just get the NPC to start moving in whatever direction we have it set, and that's going to be up. So I'll put it at the bottom of the screen so we can test to make sure that everything's working okay and it is actually just going up to the top of the screen. The next thing is we'll set the last direction to be currently the same as its current direction, which is 1. We'll set a name. So I'm going to call this is a string. This needs to be a string because we're going to be using it inside for our variable name. So for that string, I'm going to, in quotes, I'm going to put NPC and then an underscore, and then outside of the quotes, I'm going to use a index. Okay. So its name is NPC. The first time it's NPC1, NPC2, NPC3, etc., etc. We'll set its initial speed to be 2, and then maybe later on we'll play around with that. Okay, I think we have, knock on wood, but I think we have enough here to actually run a test of our program. So before we do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that it's actually calling into here. I know it is, but why not do a test? So I'm going to make sure our loop is working and we get a GUI with a red square somewhere on it. Okay, so I have this here tooltip, so our loop is working and we have a red square on our GUI. Perfect. we're gonna the last couple of tutorials, what we've done is everything, all of our code was built right into our loop. This time what we're gonna do is we're gonna start working on how we can separate this out. We're gonna start with just using functions, but later on we'll go into creating classes, which is something that's I'm still trying to pick up myself, because I've learned best by watching video tutorials. And I don't know if you noticed, but there's not really a lot of YouTube videos on AutoHotkey. I'm pretty much like, I have hundreds of them. There's like 50 other, there's just, okay, there's no good tutorials on object-oriented programming and AutoHotkey on YouTube. I have to create them. If I want there to be videos, I actually have to go out and create them. Or so, maybe you know how to do them, and you can go out and create some tutorials. Thank you. That would be great. So in our game loop, like I said, we're gonna start splitting out our code, and we're gonna break it up into some functions. Now, I'm not gonna worry about if the functions are perfectly designed or anything like that. I really don't care. It's just the concept of just starting to break it out, and then, you know, if I want to later on, which is code for never, if I want to later on, I can go and refactor my code and see which part is not as efficient as it could be, and blah blah blah. I don't really care about that, but you know, I could do it. So I'm not going to worry too much about, as long as it works, I'm okay. So how are we going to do this? Well, in our game loop, each time it comes into our game loop, what we're going to do is we're going to have it loop over the number of NPCs that we have. Because NPCs are the only thing that we're going to be using in our game loop. Like, we don't have a player plus NPCs plus bullets plus other physical objects, etc., etc. So we only have one thing, so we're only going to be looping over that NPC. So we're just in here. We're going to do the same thing we did in our GUI, which is loop over the length of our NPC objects, or the NPC array of objects. Loop. And we're looping over NPC dot length. And I think I'll break this up into two different functions. One function will deal with checking to make sure that our player is still in the game board and moving the player, and the other function will deal with actually programming the logic of what direction it's going to be moving in at any given time. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function, and the name of it doesn't really matter, but I'm going to call it move NPC. And I'm going to pass it the current object to it. So what I'm going to pass into this function is the NPC object of the current index. So I'm going to pass NPC, or I'm going to pass the argument of that whole object. And then by doing it this way, I don't have to pass it its X, its Y, I'm just passing the whole object, and then inside of the function it can access all those members. So NPC, which NPC am I going to be passing it? I'm going to be passing it the current index. Okay, so there's our first function call. Now let's go ahead and define our function. So rather than using the same NPC a index blah blah blah, what I'm going to do is, this isn't technically how you use the word this, but I'm going to use it because like I said, I've been playing around over the last couple of months with object-oriented programming, and I've gotten kind of used to liking to be able to type out this dot x, this dot y, instead of NPC bracket a index close bracket dot x, right? So what I'm going to do is, when I pass this object into the function, it's going to change its name. It's going to create basically a copy of it, and the name of that copy isn't going to be NPC a index. It's just going to be this. So it's going to loop through. It's going to call to this function, and it's going to, and so let's say you're the function, and I'm saying, hey, hold this thing. And you say, what thing? And I say, this thing. So you know which thing we're talking about when I say this, because I just showed you. So we're going to be operating on this NPC, and what NPC it is, it's the one that I just handed you, this one. Okay, so like I said, this first function is going to deal with movement, so we'll put in the detection of the border to make sure our NPC is still within the confines of our game, and we'll add to its X and Y position based on its direction. So let's first what we'll first do is we will check which direction it's currently moving, and then afterwards we'll check if it's okay. We'll check its direction, we'll add to its X or Y position, and then after that we will check to see if after we've changed its X or Y position, if it's still inside the game's boundary. If it's not in the game's boundary, we'll hard code the game's edge, but you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, I'm going to set this up. I could set this up as just long if statements, like if, else if, blah, 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 but I'll use some ternary statements. So this is the way I like to write them out. You can write them out in a different way than I do, whatever. I don't use them that often, so this is the way I like to use them. So I'm going to put inside of, this is basically the if that I'm testing. So I'm going to say if this dot x, which x am I talking about? So this dot x, it's the NPC that I'm currently using. So I only have one NPC, so it's currently just that one NPC. So this dot x is the x for this NPC. I'm going to say, is that x less than 0? Question. So I'm asking the question, is it less than 0? If it is less than 0, then what I want to do is I want to take that x... No, I'm jumping ahead. First, we're supposed to check the direction. So I'm going to say, is the direction equal 1? So am I moving up? Question mark. If I am moving up, what I want to do is I want to take its y, this dot y, its y position, and I want to plus equals, no, I want to minus equals because we're moving up, which means we're getting into smaller y values, minus equals this dot speed, so the NPC's speed, colon, ask a new question. So this is or else. This is my else. Else is this dot direction equal to, or am I moving to the right? Question. That's a question. If the answer is yes, then take this dot x, and I'm moving to the right, so I'm adding to it. This dot plus equals this dot speed. Else, ask a new question. What's the question? Is this dot direction equal 3? If the answer is yes, then take this, because I'm moving down now, I'm going to take this dot y, and I'm going to, down is y getting a higher value, so plus equals this dot speed. Else is this dot direction equal 4? That's a question, so what is, if the answer is yes, then what do I want to do? I want to take this dot x, and because we're moving to the left, x is getting smaller, so minus equals this dot speed. Okay, now we're actually going to have 5 directions, but I only need to test 4 of them because the 5th direction is no direction at all. Okay, so now what I've done is I've tested to see what the direction is, and then so let's assume that it's going up. So if it's moving up, take the y value and remove its speed. So if it was 10, now it's 8. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to check to see if its new y position or x position, if it is still within the game's boundaries. So in a new ternary statement, I'm going to say, is this dot x less than 0? That's a question. If it is, then I want to take this dot x and make it equal 0. So if when I just moved my player or my NPC, if I moved it out of the left side of the screen, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that's actually not what I want. I actually just want it to stop at the edge at 0, so it's going to reset that, and my keyboard sometimes misses H. So if it's less than 0, say that's not actually what I want. What I actually want is 0. Okay, so if that isn't the case, what we'll do is we'll check if now because our NPC can only move in 4 directions and only one direction at any given time, like we could have made it so that way it, let's say, moves in 8 directions, so it can move up to the right or down to the right or down to the left and right. So we can change. So I'm going to split this up into x, checking the x value and the y value as different statements, but because we only have 4 directions, I could actually put them all in the same statement. But just in case later on sometime I might want to change it so that way it has 8 directions, separating the x and y as their own statements is a little bit better, because each time it moves it can be outside in the x and the y. Right? And if I put everything all in one statement, then it's only going to check to see, let's say, the x. So if the x is out of bounds, it's going to correct that. But if the y also went out of bounds, it's not going to be checking that because it's already done the statement and checked. So like I said, I'm going to check both the x and the y as their own statements, even though we don't need to in this case, because we can only move we can only move in one direction at a time. Like we can't move along the x and the y axis in the same instance. But just in case maybe later on you would want to, we'll separate it out into 2 statements. One checks the x, the other checks the y. So okay, so we've checked if x is less than 0, then set x to 0. The next thing we're going to check is if that's not true, then we're going to say, is this dot x greater than the game object dot width minus this NPC's dot width. So in our case, our game board is 500, the NPC is 50, so basically we're saying, is the x value greater than 450? That's a question. If it is, then set this dot x, or the NPC's x, to be equal to the game dot width minus this NPC's dot width, or set it to 450 in our case. Okay, so that deals with the x. Like I said, we could technically put the y as a continuation on this, but we will do it as its own ternary statement. So we'll come down here and we'll start a new one. We'll say, is this dot y less than 0? That's a question. If the answer is yes, then this dot y equals 0. Else, is this dot y greater than game dot height minus this NPC's height? That's a question. If it is, then this dot y is equal to the game's height minus the NPC's height. Okay, there we go. And I think we can actually now move our NPC. So the last thing we'll do inside of this function is actually move our NPC. So to do that, we'll just do GUI control. And it's window 1. We're going to be moving. What are we going to be moving? We're going to be moving, we need to put this as an expression. It's this dot name And where are we going to be moving it? As an expression, we're going to be moving it to its new x, which is this dot x, and y, this dot y. Okay. So like I said, when we took our object up here and I set the y value so that it was at the bottom of the screen, we also have it set to be moving in the upwards direction, or the direction 1. So now we can actually run a test and see to make sure that our NPC actually is moving up. When it's not going to be moving around anywhere else, it's just going to move up until it gets to the top of the screen. So this is our first test. And there we go. So our NPC is moving. Okay. Now what we need to do is create some logic that actually determines which direction it's going to be moving in at any given time. So that's going to be our next function. And we could technically do that before we do the move and everything else, but it doesn't really matter. Like, we've already set up here, we've set a direction and we've set a last direction. So we don't need to do it before we move it the first time. And then after, as soon as it moves, now we're going to give it a new thing. So let's call this set direction. And once again, we're going to be passing it the object, the NPC object, NPC a index, or the current queued up object. So there's our call to that function, and down here we'll create it. And once again, I'm going to change that name to be called this, because it's so nice typing out this dot direction rather than NPC whatever index. Okay. So what are we going to do in here? The first thing we're going to do in here is, because we've just finished moving, what we're going to do is we're going to say that this dot last direction is equal to, now I might need to change this around afterwards, but for now I think I just want to put this out, and then afterwards, if I need to, if this isn't working the way I want it to, I can adjust where I place this. But I know at some point or another I need to put its current direction into its last direction, and then change its current direction. So this, and we don't actually need it for the first thing I'm going to demonstrate, but this dot direction. Okay, so we've assigned a new value, hopefully, to our last direction. And what's the next thing we're going to do? The next thing we're going to do is we are going to create a random number. And that random number, I'm just going to call dir. Even though it looks like it's the same as this thing here, this dir here, it's two different things. So don't be confused. If you want, you can change this dir to be something different than that exact thing, but they're not actually the same thing. And I'm going to, for the moment, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to work with 5 directions. So up, right, down, left, and no direction at all. So I'm going to set a random number between 1 and 5. And then what I'm going to do is I am... Okay, yes. So I don't need to do... I'm going to do a test. I'm going to do a test here. And I'm going to say, I'm going to see... I'm going to say... I'm going to say, is direction less than or equal to 5? That's a question. If it is less than or equal to 5, then this dot direction equals that variable dir. And now we have enough to run. So now we have a random walk with our NPC. But as you'll notice once we run this, so I think everything should be okay. If we run this, we're going to have this spastic NPC. Now let's change. I'm going to change its Y position back to being closer to the center of the game board again. So I put the Y back to 250, so it's a little bit closer to the center again. So we can see, but we have this spazzing out NPC, right? This isn't any good. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to make it so that way it tends to want to keep moving in the same direction it was moving in before. So, because right now every single frame of animation, which is like 60 times per second, it can possibly move in a new direction, which nobody moves like that unless you have, I don't know, having a seizure or something. So let's set it up so that way it tends to want to keep moving in the same direction it was moving in the last time. So instead of picking a random number between 1 and 5, what we're going to do is let's see how this progresses until we get something that we want. So let's say instead of between 1 and 5, we'll put it between 1 and 25. In our statement down here, what we're going to say is if direction is not less than or equal to 5, it must obviously be more than 5. So what we're going to do is we're going to say that in that case, this dot direction you know what? I don't think we need to do we don't actually need to do that. I don't think you know what? We might not actually need that last direction variable. I'm going to try. See, right now, if we have a value between 1 and 5, it's going to change the direction to be that value. But if it's outside of that range, it's not going to do anything to our direction. So I don't actually need, I don't know why I was thinking I needed this. But yeah, I don't think I need this. I think right now I can just comment that out and it's not going to. So right now what we should see is, because we have 20 numbers that are, our random number generation can create 20 numbers that are outside of what we're looking for. It's going to tend to, more often than not, be one of those numbers, which means our direction isn't going to change. So if our NPC was moving up, chances are on the next frame of animation, it's more than likely going to be moving up again. Right? So here we can see it's still a little bit jittery, right? But it is moving much further in whatever direction before it changes to a new direction. Right? It could, at any moment, it could change directions, but it tends to want to stay at the same direction as it was before. So let's fix this a little bit more to make it so that way it continues on that same direction a little bit longer before it decides. Once again, it can, from any one frame to the next frame, it can change its direction, but we want it to tend to, more often than not, stay on the same direction a little bit longer. And then later on, in future tutorials, we'll go over programming it so that way we kind of steer it towards something. Like perhaps it can move a little bit to the left, it can move a little bit to the right, maybe it can go back a little bit, but overall it's going to tend to want to move to a specific place. It's not going to follow a direct path to that place, but it's going to gradually wander closer and closer to that location. So let's set this to 100 and see what that gives us. So now we have a random number between 1 and 100. If it's between 1 and 5, we set that as a new direction. If not, it keeps the old direction. So if it has 96 out of 100 numbers is going to be the same as it was before. So it's our little guy, it's walking around. Oh, it stops for a second, smells the flowers. Oh, changes directions. Let's go ahead and change this. Let's add it a little bit more. Let's try 200. And we can add extra logic in here so that way let's say it uses this Actually, you know what? Let's set that up. Let's actually set that up. What we'll do is I'm going to have two different sets. One set is going to be between 1 and 100. The second set is between 1 and 300. And what I will do... Now, I probably should have thought out how I'd work this out before I actually said, hey, you know, let's do this thing that I don't know really how to set it up. But, we have this variable, this last direction, as a variable that we're not using. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that for a purpose that it wasn't originally intended. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this. No, I'm going to put this. I'm going to say if this dot last direction. Now this might not work out the way I'm intending it to, but whatever. If this last direction, before I say this last direction, I'm going to add 1 to it. So it started out at 1, now it's 2, and then it's 3, and then it's 4, and then it's 5. If it's less than 100, and how about less than or equals to? If it's less than or equal to 100, then use this setup here. Else if ++ is direction is less than 200, less than or equal to 200. Okay. So this one is only going to be true if it's less than 100. Because this takes precedence over this else if, I don't have to actually set this as a range between 100 and 200. Because if this is true, then this is never going to get executed. So I don't need to actually set it so that way I'm testing if I'm between 100 and 200. I can just say if it's less than 200. So if it's less than that, use this setup, and we'll say else, else just change this dot last direction colon equals, well, so I'm going to go back up to the object and I'm going to change it to 0, but here I'm going to set it to 0. So I've set if this last direction is like 201, set it back to 0. Up here in the object, I'm going to set the starting value for this last direction to 0. Okay, there we go. So we should see some different kind of patterns of movement. So it's going to, in the first set, it's going to tend to slightly want to stay on the same path before it changes directions, and in the second set it's going to really tend to want to stay on its same path. So we should see a little bit more randomization of how it's going to be moving around. And this is just how I'm just putting this as a kind of a stand-in for some other kind of logic that we'd actually want to use. And we can play with these values. We can add a third statement if we want. So let me change this down to, let's say, 30. So 30. So when it's in here, it's going to be all spastic, and then when it's out, down here, it's going to tend to want to. So it's up here. It's like it's really confused, and then here it's kind of has a purpose. So it's confused. Now it has a purpose. Now it's confused. Now it has a purpose. And we can adjust the timing. So let's say if I want this to be 200 and this to be 400. So it's going to loop. It's going to do this part for 200 loops, and then it's going to do this for 400 loops or frames. So it's spastic, and then it's got purpose. And then it's going to go back to being spastic and then have purpose. Okay, that is it. We're at 45 minutes, so I don't think I want to push this tutorial longer to create the ability to resize the window. Because right now, like, we can technically, right now, we can resize the game, but it's still only going to be working within the first 500 by 500 pixels. Like, it's never going to leave that area. So what I was going to do is I was going to set it up so that way each time I adjust the size of the window, it recalculates the place that our little object can go. But we don't have enough time for that. I hope you enjoyed. If you like these kind of tutorials, be sure to hit that like button. They take a long time to make. If you can't take 2 seconds to hit the like button, why should I spend hours creating these tutorials? Anyways, have a good day. Peace.